All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Amira Makansi. It's June 14th, 2024. We're at Stoller Vineyards in Dayton. And first question to you, Amira, is why wine?
Why wine? What a great question. I couldn't really tell you, honestly. I fell into it almost by happenstance in some ways, and then when I look back, it also feels simultaneously like destiny. So I got into wine because when I was a sophomore, in between my freshman and sophomore year in college, I got the opportunity to go work a summer internship for a nutraceuticals company in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was raised. I was going to college in Chicago, but I was back home for basically 8 weeks of the summer. And I did a marketing internship where my job was to call doctors' offices and ask them if they wanted free samples of a new product that we were releasing. And it was a great job, but I sat under fluorescent lights in a cubicle in an over-air-conditioned space and made phone calls for 8 hours a day for 8 weeks out of the summer. That was the first half. And then the second half, I got to go to France, to the southern part of the Côte d'Aron, and work with a connection of my dad's. He knew this guy from the power industry who his son had just bought a parcel of land in France, 30 hectares, and a winery that was about, I think the previous owner had owned it for about 30 years before he purchased it anew. So this was 2008. This gentleman was American. He had been born and raised in America, but was Norwegian by birth. So his parents were Norwegian, and his wife was Champenois. So he was also a classically trained chef. She was a French woman, so she was an amazing cook. They had 3 kids, and I lived for a month on this idyllic little vineyard and winery in a very old, 200-year-old French house in the Côte d'Aron. And there was 12th century ruins of a castle up on the hillside, and I would go out and work in the vineyard in the morning and watch the sunrise through the grape leaves and over the castle. And then I would go in and help him clean this 30-year-old cellar, and it was pretty gross and nasty work. And yeah, there was a lot of work to be done. I spent a lot of time with the pressure washer that summer, and or I should say for that month-long period. But then, in the interim, in the mornings, we would drink coffee and eat peaches and pears from the orchard, and then at lunch they would make quiche and salad, and we would drink red Burgundy, and I was like, marketing internship under fluorescent lights in an over-air-conditioned cubicle, or this? And, it kind of changed the course of my life that summer. So I had been thinking about a career in law. I am very opinionated, very argumentative, and I like to talk. You can probably tell already. And so that was sort of the direction that my life had been pushing me up to that point. And then, I had that experience of being like, well, this could be my future, or this could be my future. And it just changed immediately. So from there, I was at the University of Chicago, which is a pretty prestigious school, but they're known for being remarkably unpractical. Like, there aren't even any majors that are in pre-med or engineering. It's all incredibly academic, like you're going on to get a PhD or maybe you're going to go to medical school or law school, but the understanding is that it's an academic sort of institution. And so they didn't even have, like a degree in biology that I could achieve because I would be competing with all the pre-meds. So I decided instead of changing my major and trying to go into something, scientific that might have something to do with viticulture and enology, I would just graduate in 3 years, which was very achievable, with a degree in history. And I do still love that field so much, and then go and try and get a job at a winery. And that is the beginning of it all.
Amazing. We'll catch back up there in a moment. Let's talk about life before that. Tell me about where you're born and raised and sort of life before college.
Yeah, so I like to say that I've been on the Oregon Trail my whole life. So I was born in the suburbs of Philadelphia, about 30 minutes across the way from New Jersey. My dad was an electrical engineer. Actually, he wrote about electrical engineering, and so he commuted up two times a week to Manhattan on the 543 train from Trenton, New Jersey to Manhattan. And then when I was 9, we moved from the suburbs of Philadelphia to St. Louis, Missouri, to be closer to my mom's family. It was a big change. I think I went through a little bit of culture shock. We went from being more suburban to being actually more urban. So I went from having, fields and trees in my backyard. And I always, as a kid, I had this, kids just have crazy big imagination. So I would pretend that I was camping, and I would go out and grill hot dogs on a fake fire in my backyard. And then I moved to St. Louis, and it was oh, you can't do that anymore. You're surrounded by dumpsters, and St. Louis was a challenging place to live at that time. There was a lot of violence, and I like to say that if you stayed up late enough at night, you could hear gunshots in the alley. So it was very much culture shock for me. But we lived there, my parents lived there until 2016. I lived there until I went to college, 2007. So that was when I moved to Chicago. I had been, part of the reason I wanted to go into law was because I was obviously argumentative and talkative, but I had been doing mock trial for several years, which I really enjoyed. Perfect outlet for all of those chatty impulses. And so that was a great way for me to sort of hone my presentation and public speaking skills. And there's really nothing like being a 14-year-old and having to go up against an 18-year-old senior in high school who's cross-examining you, or you're having an objection fight in front of the judge. And it really will sharpen your mental instincts and make you quick-witted and think quickly on your feet. So I won't say that I was the best at that, but I did enjoy the opportunity to sort of sharpen those mental skills. So then, lived in St. Louis until 2007, graduated from high school there, and then went to college in Chicago.
So after having this sort of the changing moment, tell me about coming out of France, thinking about wine. What did you visualize as what you would do in wine?
Yeah, so initially I thought I was going to be in production. I even despite having this sort of dirty, hands-on, pressure washing for a month sort of experience of winemaking, I really still thought that there might be some glamour in it somewhere. And then it took me a few good solid years of being in wine production to have that notion beat out of my head. And I realized that basically, until you get up to the winemaker level, where you're blending and tasting, and that's basically all you're doing, it's mostly a janitorial job. It's very blue collar. And you get your hands dirty, and you're bumping around between barrels and climbing up stacks of barrels and, racking and all that stuff. So cellar work is not as easy or as clean as I sort of thought it would be. And it took a good few years for me to sort of learn that. So coming out of France, I knew that it was hard work. I knew it was dirty work. But I sort of maybe thought that there might be a light at the end of that tunnel. But also, when I was 18, 19, I was super into that. I was yeah, this is great. I'm getting a great workout. I'm having fun. It's a totally different life than everything I had done before. So it felt really fun and engaging. And then when I sort of started working in the industry full time, I was oh, I don't know if I am so up for being in production for the rest of my life. So there was a transition point at some point where I was I think maybe I want to get more into the sales and hospitality side. And that also sort of happened to me a little bit coincidentally. So it's worth mentioning that as a sidetrack to all of this stuff. So when I graduated from college, had this whole separate experience where my mom had a crazy dream and decided she wanted to turn it into a novel. And she enlisted my sister and I for help with this, and we started writing this book, and we wrote the book, and it turned out it was pretty good. So then we published the book, and it turned out it was pretty good, and people were buying it, to our great surprise. And then we had to write the next book, and then we had to write the next book, and pretty soon we had a trilogy on our hands. And it ended up being an Amazon best-selling young adult dystopian series. We sold over 40,000 copies, and we got a film option deal in 2016. So we're still waiting for that to actually go on and become a film. Fingers crossed, one day it might happen. But we did see a lot of success with that, and got some nice recognition. So I was sort of developing this career in wine production, and kind of in the early stages of that. But then concurrently, I was also starting to learn more about writing and publishing, and I got interested in the marketing of that because we were doing all this kind of guerrilla marketing through Facebook and Instagram, and it was all very organic, very kind of guerrilla marketing. And so I started developing this interest in marketing. And then, at some point I was given the opportunity to sort of shift out of wine production and into more sales, hospitality, and marketing. And I took it.
Let's talk about wine production first. So let's talk about your first stop after school.
Yeah.
What was the first place you worked?
Yeah. So Chris Macepink at Benton Lane Winery was the first guy to take a chance on a skinny 21-year-old from Chicago who didn't know anything about wine, and he gave me a job as a harvest intern at Benton Lane in 2010. That was my first harvest, and it was so fun. I had an absolute blast. And in addition to that, it was like the first time that I had been to Oregon. So my mom and I drove out in my little Scion TC, packed up the car and drove cross country, came out through the gorge. I remember driving out through the gorge and being like, what is this place? And then coming into Portland, and we had dinner at this very cute little Indian restaurant downtown, right downtown in Portland, and we asked for a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir because I was going to work in Oregon Pinot Noir, and the server recommended a bottle of Penner-Ash. And it was delicious, and we loved it, and of course we were going to love it. There was no question we were going to love it. It was just too connected to what was happening in my life at the time. So that was a really nice sort of first experience, and then I drove down, and I had a really cool connection as far as like where I was going to live. So Benton Lane is kind of, it's not conveniently located, I would say. So it's like 35 minutes maybe from Corvallis, and then about 45 minutes from Eugene. So not really central to anything. But I got really lucky, and a friend of my mom's had a friend who lives out in a little town called Alpine, which is just outside of Monroe, which Benton Lane is just outside of Monroe. So I ended up living in this little 10-acre farm with a lady she was in her 40s. I was in my 20s. Her son was, 17, a senior in high school when I lived there. And her husband was a journeyman electrician who had just left. This was 2010, so kind of peak of the Great Recession, actually. So he had taken work about 2.5 hours away in Prineville, I think. So he was out of the house. They had a spare room, and they were looking to make a little extra cash. So they rented this, a spare room in their house to this skinny little girl from Chicago. And this woman, Sky, and I ended up being like soulmates in some ways. Like, we are best friends. I still hang out with her to this day. I just spent a week with her, or a weekend with her 2 weeks ago. We rode together. She was doing also all of this endurance riding at the time, which are like these 25, 50, or 100-mile races. So she was doing a lot of training for that, and she took me out, and I happen to have a little bit of experience with horse riding, but I got a whole bunch more with her, and we had a great time. And then, just kind of these core Oregon moments. Like, I remember, I moved there in like mid-September, and I little city girl, so I go out, and she's like, oh, feel free to pick as many raspberries and blackberries as you want. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You can just pick them? And she's like, yeah, what's wrong with you? So she gives me a bowl, and she sends me out to pick raspberries and blackberries for her, and some of them she's gonna freeze, but she's like, you can eat as many as you want. So I go out, and for breakfast I pick all these raspberries and all these blackberries and chop off a few grapes too, just like juicing grapes. And that was my breakfast. And I was like, you can do this? Like, you can just get food from the garden? I don't understand. So that was really, core memory for me. And then, another one was we would go riding, and we would go up. She lived right at the foothills of the coastal mountain range. And we would go up and to the top of some of these mountains and then look east, and you could see Jefferson, Washington, North, Middle, and South Sister. And on a really clear day, you could see, I think it's Diamond Peak. So just like looking across the valley and being like, those are snow-covered mountains over there. I mean, that's just not an experience you can have in St. Louis or Chicago, you know? So that first like week that I was there, I completely fell in love with Oregon. And then, you know, so this is all happening, and then I go to work at Benton Lane, and you know, I'm working harvest, and it was a good thing that was my first harvest, because Chris kind of had a philosophy of not overworking his interns. So we didn't have to work 7 days a week for like 2 months in a row. We got like at least 2 days off a week, I think, at least 1 day off a week through the harvest season, often 2. And Chris kind of took me under his wing a little bit. And, you know, I was a skinny little girl from Chicago who didn't know what she was doing. And he was basically like, you seem like you understand something about science and chemistry, so and I had been pretty good at chemistry when I was in high school, so he was like, I'm going to put you in charge of lab samples. You're going to pull all of the lab samples for us. And then that got me into the lab a little bit, which was nice. So then I was working with the lab tech to kind of see, okay, what's pH, what's TA, like what's Brix, how are we taking these measurements? And that was a really great way to get sort of on-the-job training about wine chemistry. You know, in its most rudimentary form. So, in addition to doing all of the punch downs and, you know, pump overs and sparging and pulse airs and all of that stuff, there was obviously like other routine cellar work that I participated in as well, and sorting and, you know, all of that. But the lab was really where I kind of found my home. So I was very grateful and lucky that Chris allowed me that opportunity. And then I came back the next year in 2011, and he did the same thing, and he kind of let me take on even a little bit more ownership. The lab tech was still there, but he was like, you can help her more now with actually running the tests and stuff. So I got to have a little bit more ownership of that, and then was able to parlay that 2 years later. I skipped a vintage, and I'll tell you about that soon, but I skipped a vintage and came back 2 years later. Chris Maespink was very good friends with Joe Wright at Left Coast Cellars, so I ended up joining Joe for his harvest season as his harvest like lab assistant, basically. They had a lab guy who was working, his name was Barry, and he was kind of managing and running the lab, but at least through the harvest season, but I got to be his official assistant, so I got to actually put like lab tech assistant on my resume. So those were my first 3 harvests in Oregon.
And why Oregon? Why did you even look at Oregon in the first place?
Yeah, great question. Pure chance. Again, so much of this is just like fortuitous happenstance. So, you know, I keep saying skinny little girl from Chicago, mainly because, you know, what that means is that I had no reason to be in wine, right? So I applied when I was leaving college, my spring of my senior year. I applied for probably 25 different harvest internship positions, and maybe 3 or 4 of them wrote me back. I applied to a whole bunch in California. I don't think I heard, maybe 1. I might have heard from 1 place in California. I heard from a couple in Oregon, but Chris was the first one to say, I'll give you a job. So it was really just pure luck that I ended up at Benton Lane in Oregon. He was the first, I mean it when I say he was the first one to take a chance on me. So that's how I got there.
So you mentioned kind of obviously the other side of things that are going on in your life at this point. You're working on those books. So tell me a little bit about that process and about from Mom's Crazy Dream to a trilogy on Amazon. How did it work for you?
Yeah, good question. So let's see. I think I was still in college when she had the dream the first time. And she like had the dream, and I don't know if have you ever been struck by like a moment of inspiration where you're like, oh my God, I gotta write this down. Has that ever happened to you? Yeah. So that happened to her, right? So, and we're a family of writers. So my dad is a technical writer, and he's written a couple of novels. My mom is these days very busily engaged in writing historical fiction romance. But at the time, she had a couple of unpublished novels under her belt as well. So, we all have always loved to read and love to write. So she has this dream, and, she immediately wakes up and writes the chapter about, writes it down, and what does it mean, and what does it look like, and told me and my sister about it. My sister's 3 years younger than me, and she was, I think, she must have been in high school at the time. And she told us about it, and she was like, I had this crazy dream, it's so cool. And we were both like, cool story, we're in college, we have too much going on to help you in any way with this. So it kind of sat in the metaphorical desk drawer for several years. And then I think it was in late 2011 or early 2012, this is the crazy part, she had the dream again. So it's like, again, it's like that voice of destiny kind of calling you and being like, no, you have to make something of this. So she had the dream again, and she, the next morning she got up and she pulled that chapter out of the desk, the metaphorical chapter out of the metaphorical desk drawer, and she came back to me and said, I had this dream again, I think this is so cool, I really want to work on this. And by pure coincidence, it was, early, by this point it was early 2012, and so I was in between harvests. It was like January or February, and I had just finished my second harvest with Benton Lane, and I had nothing else going on. I had other things going on. We'll get to that. But nothing like I'm working 80 hours a week on classes and school and research and finishing my bachelor's thesis, all of that was done. So I was like, oh, yeah, this is kind of fun. So I sat in a little coffee shop in Corvallis one rainy February day in 2012 and wrote chapter 2. And then my mom wrote chapter 3. And then I wrote chapter 4. And at some point my sister got involved and she wrote chapter 5. And, it really kind of felt like a snowball rolling downhill, just picking up steam as it went. And let's see, a little background information. So I was still trying to get into a career in wine at this time. So I had made friends with Matt Schoen, who his dad owns Brigadoon, which at the time was not focused so much on wine making. They were focused more on growing grapes for growing vines for rootstock, and doing a little bit of growing grapes and winemaking too. So I had become friends with this guy, and I was like, I'm trying to learn about wine. You have a vineyard. Do you need help? And he was like, yeah, you want to come work in the middle of February on a vineyard? You're crazy, but sure, we'll let you do that. So wearing his dad's rain gear that was 7 sizes too big for me because I didn't own rain gear. I went out on a February week and started pruning with them. And so I worked 2 or 3 days with him through that year. Through that winter to help prune their whole vineyards. And so that was kind of my first taste outside of my experience in France. That was my first taste of what actual viticultural work looks like. And learning how to prune was so important for my wine career because I got to see, I got to understand the shape of the vine and how it impacts fruit set for the coming year and the following year, and how it's such a long-term project, the setting up of these vines for success over the coming 1 to 3 to 5 years. So it really is, pruning is such an important moment in the life cycle of the vine, and so I got to kind of see all of that. So then also simultaneously I was trying to set up a stint in France where I would go and woof. So do you know about woofing? Worldwide Organization of Organic Farmers. So it's all of these, basically every country where there is, some form of agriculture, there are some participants in this. And it's basically there's farmers and then there's workers. And the workers are young, often migrants trying to travel the world and see other parts of the world and just looking for a way to travel. And then the farms are people who, they're farmers who need labor. And so the exchange is, as a worker, you go and stay on one of those farms in exchange for room and board. No payment, but room and board. And then in exchange, you do a set number of hours of work as agreed upon by the farm. So I set up a 3-month stint in France where I would go and work basically a month at a time at different vineyards, different vineyards and wineries. So I guess I landed on May 3rd of 2012 in Alsace. I landed in Strasbourg and started a month and a week of working with a winery in Amersfoort that had been around since the 1790s. Their cellar, the whole town of Amersfoort, had been bombed during World War II, so they had it was one of the few areas that had the center of the village had been completely destroyed, so almost all the wineries had rebuilt on the outskirts of town. But they had all these beautiful, Grand Cru parcels of Alsatian wine, and so I got to work there for a month. And then I went down to the Languedoc, so I basically diagonally crossed the country. I worked there for 3 weeks. I actually had kind of a funky experience there. And then I ended up finally back in the Côte du Rhône, about 40 kilometers from where I had spent that original stint, that month-long stint in 2008. So 2012, 2008, 4 years later, I find myself back kind of in the same area. So and I got tons of viticultural winemaking experience then, got to see all these different wine regions, and going from Alsace to the Languedoc was just, again, so much culture shock. People think about France as being kind of a block, all one place, and there are definitely cultural through lines that connect all of the people of France. Great pride in their wine, great pride in their products, a complete disinterest in allowing any other country any credit when it comes to food or wine. But there's also so many differences. So, for example, the Alsatians, we didn't eat a whole lot of meat when we were in Alsace. I ate a lot of bread, pasta, sauces, a lot of salads, a lot of vegetables. And then when we went down to the Languedoc, I basically ate a steak, a salad, and a piece of bread for lunch every single day. And it's just so different. And some of those things could be specific to the families that I was living with or something like that, but it was really an interesting distinction. So anyway, so I did that whole stint of traveling in France for 3 months, and during that time, because I had a lot of time on my hands, we weren't working really 40 hours a week. I had my laptop with me, and I also kept writing book one of the Sowing, what would eventually become book one of the Seeds trilogy. So working in France, working on the book. By the time I get back to America in August, we're 75% of the way through the book, and by the time October's here, we have completed the first draft of the book. And we sent it off to some friends, and we were like, what do you guys think about this? Will you read it for us? Will you give us your impressions? And almost to a man, they were like, this is really good. You guys should think about publishing it. So then we started working on that, and that led us to the whole sequence of events that led us to creating a trilogy somehow. So feels like a wild story telling it in retrospect.
So after that kind of experience on the wine side of things, you mentioned kind of hitting a point where the production was less exciting to you, and you started thinking about the pivot. So tell me about the pivot into sort of the other side of the industry.
Yeah. So let's see, how do I best tell this part of the story? So after my harvest season at Left Coast Cellars in 2013, so I skipped a year working with harvest in Oregon because I was traveling, and then got back kind of too late to do a harvest season. So I skipped 2012. And then in 2013, I went back to Left Coast, and I decided, I had sort of already knew that I wanted to do this, but I decided I was going to very seriously try to find a full-time job in the wine industry, and in production specifically. So I guess I feel like Oregon at the time was still so small compared to California. I was applying to all these jobs as a lab tech or enologist, and the vast majority of them were in California. So I ended up, again, through connections, Chris to Joe, and then Joe to a friend of his named Terry Colton. Terry was the winemaker at a winery in Paso Robles called Peachy Canyon. And I had definitely thought that I had this big, I still do have an interest in those Rhone-style wines, from my time in the Rhone. I love Grenache, I love Syrah, I love those blends. And they were doing so much of that in Paso Robles that I figured, when when that opportunity came up, I was like, this sounds like a nice fit for me. So, and then it just kind of worked out. I didn't even know when I sent off my resume to Peachy Canyon Winery, I didn't know that the winemaker Terry Colton and winemaker Joe, who I just finished working with, knew each other, but they very quickly started talking, and then pretty soon I had the job. So I started working I moved down from Oregon to Paso Robles, California in January of 2014. And started my career in the laboratory world. So started off as a lab tech there. And, I think what I discovered about the production side of wine is, and some people love this, but it wasn't quite it for me, is that it's just so cyclical. Like, first, I kind of think of it as like starting with harvest season, because that's where I started. That's where most people start their career. So first there's harvest season, and then there's like, putting the wines to bed, and then there's blending or tasting or maintenance, but you start blending the previous year's vintage, caring for the barrels. There's a ton of barrel work to do during that time, blending, and then summer is often like bottling. And Peachy Canyon also happened to be a winery where it's very busy almost all of the time. So I had kind of been hearing for years this, there's like the busy season and then there's the slow season. There's a busy season and there's the slow. You'll get some extra time off during the slow season. That was not true. We bottled for 3 months out of the year at Peachy Canyon, and we were working 10-hour days, 10.5-hour days, basically 5 days a week when that happened. And, having harvest season for 2.5 to 3 months, because it's kind of drawn out in Paso. You start harvesting early and you don't finish until later, and because they have so many varieties, so a little different than Oregon. So, being in harvest mode for 2.5 to 3 months is exhausting. And then, maybe you get a little bit of a break during the holidays, but then the rest of the year we were doing blending and bottling just so much. And I was like, I'm exhausted and I'm 24 years old. Like, this can't be how the world is, So I had been hearing about this mythical, like, slow season, and it just never really materialized for me. So I worked there for 2.5 years and found myself getting, like, kind of burnt out, and I was like, I don't understand how this is possible. I'm 25 years old. I can't be burnt out, And then there was also this aspect of it being really cyclical. And I think my second year there, I was kind of like, I'm doing the exact same things that I was doing this time last year. And that just wasn't really stimulating for me. I found myself, instead of being excited by it, which I know, I have a lot of winemaker friends. I talk to people they love that cyclicality of it, but it just, it didn't work for me. And so when the books started to take off, I was like, maybe I'll shift into that direction. I'm going to focus my energies on writing and marketing and sales. And then that's kind of like how I ended up following that track. So in 2016, I left Peachy Canyon and I moved back up to Oregon. I had always known I wanted to end up at Oregon. Ultimately, I was like, I love California, but it's not the place where I want to make my home. I was honestly like a little concerned about all of the water. We were deep in drought at that time, and I was like, I don't know if wine grapes are going to be able to grow forever here. I knew there's so much talk about climate change, and so anyway, I was like, I'm going up to Oregon. There's rivers, there's trees, there's water up there. I know that for a fact. So I'm going to go back to Oregon. So I left Peachy Canyon and I just kind of took a casual job at Domaine Serene in 2016 as a harvest intern. So I worked up the hill from here we are now at Stoller, and really had a great time. And then, they ended up keeping me on at Domaine Serene through the rest of the season, and I found myself doing the exact same thing that I had been doing before, just bottling and working, and they're kind of grueling in the same way up the hill as they were at Peachy Canyon, so it was just like a lot of intense work. And but concurrently, I had started writing and pitching a new book called Literary Libations. What to Drink with What You Read, Drink Pairings for Famous Works of Literature. And so I started working on that. I wrote a book proposal. I submitted it to an agent. I had an offer of representation within 2 days with that book proposal, which was awesome. And then my agent, Andrea Somberg, started taking the book out into the market and trying to sell it. So during that time, I was working at Domaine Serene. And then I got the opportunity to move down to Southern Oregon. My partner at the time was taking a job in a winery down there. So we moved down there and I spent the next 4.5 years in Southern Oregon. And I spent a couple of years kind of like just doing my own thing, working on the book, working on my marketing career, working on, focusing on my author career. And then when that wasn't quite lucrative enough to pay all the bills, I turned back to the winery job, and I got a job at Irvine and Roberts, a very small winery in Southern Oregon, I think my first title was Wine Club and Marketing Coordinator. And so that was like my pivot away from production. I was like, I'm done with all the bottling. I'm done with all the, done with banging my hands on, hose instruments and gas nozzles and smacking my head against the underside of a stairway and like racking 80 barrels a day into tanks for wines that I'm never going to be able to afford. So I got out of that life and into the sales and marketing side. And that has set me on the career that feels maybe like most true to me out of all things that I've ever done. It's like the perfect combination of all of my interests. Like one of my favorite things to do is write wine tasting notes, because it's like wine and writing, just like so neatly sandwiched into one thing. So I found a really nice home in the marketing world, especially like even more so than in the club management, like the DTC side. I do still have a pretty firm foothold in that world, and I think going all the way back to my mock trial experience, it's like when you're entertaining guests and you're pouring tableside and you're telling them stories, it's like it's all kind of about the same thing, right? Like you're trying to be an entertainer, you're trying to tell people a good story, you're trying to sell them the story of the vineyard and winery. Kind of ties back into that, but I find myself just so called to that world of marketing. So, yeah.
So before we get back to that, tell me a little bit about the parallel career, the writing career, from Literary Libations. How has it progressed?
Yeah, so that was such a fun project. So Literary Libations, my agent Andrea picked it up as a book proposal, and then we sold it 9 months later to at the time, I don't know if they still are, but at the time they were the fastest growing indie publishing company in America, called Skyhorse. So we sold the book to them, and then I had 6 months to write it. Wrote the book, which 6 months is not a very long time to write a book, by the way. So did a lot of research, a lot of making cocktails at home, a lot of drinking wine, a lot of, spending time on Wikipedia. I was fortunate to live right next to the Ashland Public Library. So I can't tell you how many times I just walked across the street and was like, I'm dropping off this stack of 10 books and I'm picking up this new stack of 10 books. And so it was really such a nice resource to have. So that came out, Literary Libations was published in the fall of 2018, and I was so pleased that it saw some really strong success, to the extent that just 8 months later, they had to go into a second printing, which doesn't always happen. That kind of thing is, I think that the world sort of has this idea of writers as everybody's a millionaire and everybody makes a lot of money, and it's like so easy, and by the time you like publish your first book, you have like 4 more done, and it's just like so not that way in any capacity. That's just the illusion that doesn't even exist in reality. Except for maybe like 10 people on the planet. So the fact that, published in September of 2018, and by March of 2019 it was going into a reprint, that was really exciting. And ever since then it's seen like pretty steady sales. But the crazy thing about the book world, and I feel a little funny talking about like the background of publishing and all of that, but I think it's important that people understand and know. So the crazy thing about the book world is that, so I got a pretty small advance for that book, and 6 years later still have not earned out of it, right? So haven't seen a dime from the book after that initial advance sent to me. So despite the fact that it went into a second printing, it still sells hundreds of copies every year, right? All of that, still no money from the book. So it's really a wild, I actually think there's a lot of parallels between book writing and wine making, so it's an interesting experiment to have a foot in both worlds. But so, yeah, the book has been very successful, and it's been really fun to see it out there. And then I started writing my 5th book, which I published in September of 2021, which kind of went back into the young adult fiction dimension. So that's been my writing career.
Talk a little bit about. I mean, you mentioned obviously a lot of research, a lot of other reading and experience. Tell me a little bit about the writing process for you, and about especially fiction. How do you dive into writing?
Yeah, well, it's been very different, because I wrote the first trilogy with 2 collaborators who obviously they're family members, so such a different experience with them. And then the 5th one, the last book called The Paths Between the Stars, was really so much more challenging. I will say there's something so beautiful. I think every time when I talk about the fact that I wrote that trilogy with my mom and sister, people are like, oh my God, how did you do that? But actually, like, when I came out of that experience and then was trying to write the next one solo, I was like, how do I do this without collaborators? Because it's so nice, when you're kind of at a crossroads, you're stuck between 2 plot points, or a character isn't quite going the way that you think they are. Having those collaborators who are deeply invested in the storytelling, just like you are, really gives you inspirational, you can have conversations about, like, you can brainstorm together, you can think about ways to problem solve through that dilemma. And so I actually really loved working with my mom and sister on that project. And then the process of writing it by myself was so much harder. I started kind of like ideating on that book in 2014, and I didn't publish it until 7 years later, 2021, so not only is it pretty intense to have a full-time job and try and write a book as well, but it's just it's such a different process to create it all from scratch, just your own mind. So I really, I hope that I will be able to do it again someday, but it's the more I think about it, I'm like, wow, that's so daunting. I can't believe I did that by myself. And then there's people out there who write, dozens of books, and I'm just so impressed by that. So, but yeah, diving into the process of it. So I think, with my mom and sister, it was really fun because we, kind of how I described earlier, like, one of us would write one chapter and then the next one would write the next, and we would kind of tag team through the end of a book. That was really a great creative process. And then when I was working on my own, The Paths Between the Stars, it was much more like almost trying to like map it out. Like, do you know those, you know when you're watching like a crime show and they have the pin boards and they've got like the main guy that they're after and they've got this line and this line and this line and then like all these pieces of evidence. That's kind of how it felt. It's like trying to keep my brain organized in this different way and keep all the pieces of the plot like coming back together to create an organized storyline. So all that has to do with the fiction. I will say, though, the most fun I've ever had writing a book was writing Literary Libations. So that was basically, I call it tongue-in-cheek drink pairings for famous works of literature. And it was so silly because I got to make all these cocktails at home, right? And like work on my mixology and get a little creative. I invented a couple of cocktails for it. At the same time, I'm like trying to think about which books are going to go with which drinks and like pairing them and thinking about the historical aspect, which was really nice to bring in my, history degree. So that was, by far, like some of the most fun 6 months of my life because we were just drinking wine and beer and cocktails and thinking about how to pair them with books. So that was really exciting.
Give us an example of one of your favorite pairings.
Easy. The one that I cite for everyone is Frankenstein with a corpse reviver cocktail. Yeah. And then, of course, Dracula with a Bloody Mary. So straightforward. And I got to bring my sister in. She and I had collaborated in writing form on the trilogy, but I got to bring her in as a collaborator. She's also an artist. as a collaborator on Literary Libations. She did about 20 illustrations for the book. And my favorite one from the whole, it's like kind of became the poster for the novel, for the book, I should say, is a picture of Frankenstein with the little things coming out of his neck, holding up a Corpse Reviver cocktail, looking very zen. It's just awesome. It's so good. So I really, it's hard to get better than those two like verbal pairings. Mm-hmm.
So we talked earlier about your wine pivot into the marketing side. You mentioned it being something that felt like a very good fit for you. So tell me about your initial impressions of selling wine in that perspective, and what sells wine? What was important to you about selling wine?
This is like such an interesting, because it sort of is like the opportunity to bring it all in together, right? So it's worth mentioning as well that I spent about 10 months like in kind of maybe the biggest failure of my wine career. I spent about 10 months in distribution. I was thinking about going into the sales and distribution side, and really did not find so much of a home there, which is very funny and interesting. But so coming from production, and like I guess the thing that got me into wine, going all the way back to those first experiences in France, was just like the experiential part of it, right? Like that moment of like sitting around this table with this like sweet French family and their 3 kids and the grandparents and the dog, and like the food just came from the garden, and the wine, a Grand Cru Burgundy, but it's been in the cellar for 6 years, and he's like, oh, let's just open this for lunch, right? And it's like those moments that make wine worth it. And so I think that, it's so interesting. I think being in the wine business, we can get ahead of ourselves a little bit. We think that people are so interested in like the terroir and the soils and the pH and the TA, and like there is an element of that, right? Like wine chemistry is fascinating, wine geography is fascinating, right? There's like, you can kind of go as deep into any one of these niches as you want, and it does have such an important aspect in the bringing to life of that particular bottle of wine. But I think the reason why people drink wine doesn't have anything to do with any of those things, right? I think it has to do with people wanting to come together in that table with that salad and that bread and that cheese and the dog nearby. It's almost like going back to like a painting that you might see hanging in the Louvre, right? Of like just this very simple lifestyle with a tablescape and the sun kind of shining in the distance, and it's like it's almost like it's just idyllic, right? It's like the experiential part of it. So I think to me, what sells wine is tapping into that experience of what brings us together as families, as communities, as friends, found family. I think that when we find ourselves most enjoying the experience of purchasing or drinking wine is when we have that aspect of community, at least for me.
So tell me about coming back to the Willamette Valley.
Yeah, gosh. Well, I've done it so many times. I just keep coming back. That's why I say I've been on the Oregon Trail for my whole life. Let's see. Started in 2010, went back to Chicago and worked in restaurants for a year, came back in 2011, went traveling and went to France, and then worked in St. Louis in distribution for a year, came back in 2013, went to Paso Robles, came back in 2016, went to Southern Oregon, came back in 2022. So what was that, 5? I'm like magnetically just drawn here. I can't get away, which is like the best feeling ever. I think what I love so much about the Willamette Valley, there's 2 things. So first of all, it's like the sense of community. Even from the very first time that I was here, my very first harvest, it has felt like people are willing to take a chance, to share information and knowledge, and to really like nurture. It doesn't feel competitive, or it doesn't have to be competitive, right? And there's such a convivial spirit here in the Willamette Valley, in the wine industry specifically. So that's one thing that has brought me back to wine specifically. I think the other thing to me, is just how beautiful this place is. Like, I can see Mount Hood over there right now. Like we're looking out and I can see Mount Hood covered in snow, crystal clear. And then I can look up this way and I see like the Dundee Hills, right? And then I look out to the west and there's the coastal mountain range. And does it get any better? I don't know. Waxing poetic here. But there is something about this site that just draws me in year after year. And, I think I spoke to that a little bit when I was talking about coming back from Paso Robles and having those concerns about water. And, I remember my sister and I drove up together when I was moving back that time. We drove up again in that little Scion TC. Just couldn't get away from it for 16 years. We drove up and I remember there's this kind of transition point around the Umpqua Valley where you're driving on the 5 and it's so bendy and windy and then you sort of drop into the Umpqua River Valley. And it's like, oh my God, there's a river there. And in Paso, it's so dry that most of the rivers are dry year round. You actually don't see them run very often. And so I was just like, there's water, there's rivers, like it might rain here one day, It was insane to me, which is wild because, in St. Louis and Chicago and the eastern parts of the world, it rains all summer long. You get these beautiful thunderstorms that come through. So that was like how I had been raised. And I think that was part of why I found California very alienating in that way. There just wasn't any of that outside of like January, February, March. So coming back to Oregon, I really love, I think a lot of people here get kind of tired of the rain, but I actually love it. It doesn't bother me at all. Maybe after like 9 months of it, I'm like, okay, can we get a little sunshine here? But generally speaking, it's not, it doesn't affect me in that way. So just the presence of water is very comforting to me. And I love the greenery. I love the magnificent oaks that live on the hills. I love the Doug firs. I love the western red cedars. There's just so much green here and there's so much water and it's really a miracle.
So what brought you back in 2022?
Yeah, what a great question. I think I had realized that the Rogue Valley where I had been working was a little too small for me. So, I had been at Irvine and Roberts and I was sort of looking for a transition. I knew I was ready for another step. And there just wasn't another winery of a similar, size or commitment to quality that could really sustain the work that I was doing there. So when I was looking for other opportunities there just weren't any. Not even like they weren't hiring or they didn't have a job opening at the time. It was like there just wasn't anything available. There wasn't the kind of company that could even be asking for that kind of position. But I knew that there was here. And I also knew that Ashland or Medford are 4.5 hours or 5 hours or 6 hours away from any major metropolitan metropolitan area. And, I have city roots, right? I grew up in St. Louis. I grew up outside of Manhattan and Philadelphia. I went to college in Chicago, right? Like there's something that I feel like, even though I'm a little bit more of like country mouse these days, I really wanted to at least have access to a city. I wanted access to those restaurants and those concerts and to be able to go see a symphony, once a year, twice a year. And Medford, Ashland just didn't really, it's just so small. It's just so different. And being such a drive from any one of those areas was just a little much for me. So, as much as I loved being able to, basically run out my front door and be in the Siskiyou Mountains and on the trails, that was a beautiful, thing. And I do miss that a little bit, but I wouldn't trade it for the access to the city.
So tell me about coming to Stoller.
Coming to Stoller has felt a little bit like a homecoming, and I don't really say that to be like melodramatic or anything. It's just like you work for so many years to like find the place for you, and then you find it, and it's like, well, there we go, I did that. And so coming to Stoller, I was looking to move from Southern Oregon, and I had been doing marketing and a little bit of hospitality, but mostly marketing and club management. And then the position that was open here at Stoller was an assistant hospitality manager position in the Heritage Tasting Room, or I should say across the Stoller campus. And I was really just looking for an opportunity to join the teams. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but I saw the B Corp, I saw, the sustainability, I saw the commitment to the employees, and I was like, this seems like a good place. It seems like a good fit. And So I just took the in, right? And interviewed for the position and was basically offered the job 2 days later. And within 3 weeks, I was moving up here and had everything ready to go. It was like slow, and then fast, right? I feel like that's how so many things go, right? So yeah, slow, and then fast. And then here I am, I think April 2nd, 2022 was my first day. It happened to be the very first day of our spring club release in the tasting room, which was just perfect, throw the girl into the fire. But I have a very strong hospitality and restaurant background, so it was no problem. And then kind of got into it. And what I found here is that there is like so much. Not only was there so much already happening, but there's so much potential. So I was very lucky that I was given, my boss at the time gave me the opportunity to work on a project that I really had no right to be working on in the assistant hospitality manager position. But he was asking me to write a proposal for a campus-wide signage refresh. It was basically something, he was like, people are asking me to do this. I don't have the time and I don't want to. Will you do it for me? And I was like, perfect. Like, thank you so much for the opportunity. So I wrote this like very long, like 5 or 6 page creative brief about all of the signs that we needed to update and how we should think about doing it. But the intro was what was like the best part, because I got to talk about the potential that I see here at Stoller. So, let's see, we've been, the Stoller family purchased the farm in 1943. So I think at the time, 2022, I was like, given another 21 years, and this will technically be a century farm, right? And I love driving around Oregon, and you can see those notices of this is century farm. There's just so much agricultural history here. And so even looking into the future and being able to say, like, we'll be able to talk about this in our future. Like, we can start to set the tone for it now, and establish this as like a, it comes back to that history degree, right? Like, we're setting the seeds to talk about the history of the property in an even more expansive way than we're talking about it now, right? And just seeing the way that Stoller fits into the overall piece of the Oregon wine puzzle and being able to participate in that is really beautiful. So I love that. And it comes back to that like idea of storytelling and of bringing people together. That's something else that I just love so much about this place. And, we're kind of like looking out on it happening right now even, but like people are sitting out there like hanging out with friends under the umbrellas. There's like a couple of people at some picnic tables, and like coming together to enjoy the wine and the food and the property and taking the views and just share a good time together. So, I feel like Stoller is a real like communal gathering place for people. We have kind of a vision of becoming like a third place. There's that conversation about like your home is like place 1, and then your work is place 2, or your church or your community, or, it's sort of evolved through the years. But then like, what is that third place? So, at different times in history, it's been like the bar, or it's been the coffee shop, or, whatever, it kind of evolves. But like, can we have a role in being that third place for the people of the Willamette Valley? Can we be that gathering place?
So how has your role evolved since you got here?
Yeah. So I started as the assistant hospitality manager, in 2022. And, I got to meet Gary, and I know you guys have interviewed him. And Gary, I don't know, he just kind of was like, what's going on up there? What have you got kicking around in your brain? And at some point I showed him one of the holiday gift guides that I had done for Irvin and Roberts, in conjunction with a team of people down there. But, I had sort of like helped orchestrate. And Gary was like, you did this? And I was like, well, yeah, I had photographers and I had designers and all of that. And he was like, yeah, but you like kind of directed this? And I was like, I did. And he was like, cool. Maybe just come see me in my office someday. And it didn't quite go down like that. I'm being a little bit poetic. I'm taking a little poetic license here. But essentially, he sort of saw that I had a marketing background. And he was like, we're going to get you onto the marketing team. And without ever making any promises like that, that's just sort of what happened. And then, so in January of 2023, I moved into the marketing team as the digital marketing manager. And then just about 9 months later, the marketing director left, and I was moved into her space as the director of marketing. So it has been a pretty wild ride, I'll say, but I am so grateful for my time in the Heritage Tasting Room and in the digital marketing role, because it really helped to like set the foundation for the hospitality experiences that we're trying to offer, for the conversations that we're having with our guests, for the stories we're trying to tell, and for what's worked in the past, right? And then going into the marketing side and trying to tell those stories through a digital lens, and now running the department and being able to tell them across the whole marketing sphere, from social media to our collateral to our video production, and really being able to think so strategically about those specific stories that we want to tell. How to get them out to as many people as possible, and then how to use those different sort of channels to distribute those stories.
What is different about marketing wine now, and what are your kind of focuses as you look ahead for sort of the changing in wine marketing?
I haven't been in wine marketing for that long, actually, really since 2019 when I started with Irvine and Roberts. And, that was in Southern Oregon. So I guess it's been 5 years. So a little different. I think that Stoller and some of the bigger wineries here have such a unique opportunity to sort of tell the story of Oregon to the national market. So we sort of get to be the brand ambassadors for all of Oregon on behalf of Oregon wineries in the national market. That was not an opportunity that I had in my past, where we were trying to just tell this very, unique story of this unique place with a unique focus. So it's a little bit like that in my role has shifted. And then as far as marketing has shifted, I think, we're continuing to understand the importance of connecting all of the channels. And maybe I'm getting even a little bit beyond marketing here, but like as a marketing team, our job is not just to market wine. Our job is to market hospitality experiences. Our job is to market that communal experience. Our job is to market on the national markets, right? So we have to break down all of those silos in order to tell the story of the whole property. So I think about, marketing is not just about understanding like digital strategy or content creation or video creation. It's about organization-wide, like thinking holistically about who we are, how we tell the story, and how we approach our customers. So I think that is something that maybe has changed for me personally in my perspective. Industry-wide, it's been really wild to watch the shifts that have happened over the last 5 years. So starting in 2019, and just kind of like seeing Oregon on the national stage. But then 2020 hit, and COVID, and everything shifted to digital and e-commerce and social media because we didn't have another way to talk to people. Nobody could come through our doors, right? So like just how wildly everything shifted from like in-person marketing to now we have to be like exclusively digital, and going to e-commerce and all of those facets of it. And then it's almost like the roller coasters come back around the other way now, and people want in-person events and experiences, and just trying to meet the customer at all of these different journey points, like wherever we can, over this roller coaster of the last 5 years, right? So, there's been so much of that. And then I think the last thing that, is kind of like the elephant in the room that we all have to be willing to talk about is the sort of like ideological battle for the hearts and minds of consumers with the health question, right? There's so many people, there's a lot of stories and articles and, information, whether it be valid or not, out there about how alcohol consumption in any form is really quite negatively effective of your health. And so I think, are dealing with that challenge on the global stage, not even just the national stage. We're really looking at that from the WHO and from the FDA, and there's the possibility that the FDA is going to revise their alcohol intake guidelines, and just being really cognizant of some of those changes that may be coming. And in conjunction with that is like alcohol labeling requirements and potentially needing to put nutritional information on the labels. And so there are some very big picture conversations happening about almost like the future of the wine industry at large that I think were not happening when I first started. So yeah, it's that kind of ideological, I hesitate to call it a battle. I know I called it that earlier, but it's like this ideological challenge, I guess is what I would call it. So,
tell me about marketing to younger consumers. Obviously, an ongoing battle in the wine industry as well. What is your approach when it comes to the newer consumers?
Yeah, I think, we're always trying to talk about, I like to think about everything as far as meeting people where they are. So with marketing specifically, for me, almost everything comes back to the idea of that marketing funnel, right? At the top, you have, and this is true for anything, any business, doesn't have to be true for wine or Stoller or anything, but at the top of the funnel, you have your broadest group of consumers who maybe have never heard of your brand or have only heard of you once. They're just lightly aware of you. And your job is to take them from the very top of that funnel all the way down to the very bottom of the funnel, which is devoted, loyal customers who are going to buy your wine over or your product over and over and over again. And they know about you, they're brand ambassadors, they tell all their friends about you, all of that. So that's at the very bottom of that funnel. And so because alcohol is an age-gated thing, right? You can't legally drink alcohol until you're 21 years old. And also just I think a lot of people think about wine as requiring a lot of education and understanding and knowledge. So if you think about a 22-year-old, as I was once upon a time, just trying to learn about wine, you're at that very top of the funnel. You just don't know very many brands. You don't know varieties. You don't barely know what the difference between red and white wine is, And so our job is to connect with those customers at an educational level and on the platforms and channels that they want to be talked to. So, for example, reaching them through TikTok or reaching them through influencers or brand collaborations with brands that are aimed at sort of a younger demographic, right? There are ways to meet those consumers where they are and start to educate them, nourish them, give them information that will lead them into the deeper parts of that funnel.
So you've talked a little bit about sort of the changes you've seen. Tell me about what comes next for Oregon wine, for the industry at large, or just from your perspective, sort of the marketing of Oregon wine.
Yeah. Man, don't you wish you had a crystal ball? Just shake it up and be like, where are we going?
Wish I had one in 2019.
Yeah, right? Things might have been very different if we had been able to predict any of that. Yeah, where are we going? I mean, I think that, to the ideological challenges that we just spoke of, I do think there are some challenges afoot to not just Oregon wine, but to the wine industry at large, mainly as it relates to that health question. I think, however, that, we have seen this, again, coming back to my background in history, if you look back at not just the last decade or the decade before, but 200 years ago, right? There was a huge temperance movement in the 19th century that then, was fueled by religious, inspiration and motivation, and then by the feminist movement, actually, because there was, a huge part of that was wrought just by the fact that women, so often the victim of domestic abuse at the hands of their husbands, which was tied into alcohol, which was tied into drinking, and so the temperance movement was actually, closely correlated with the rise of feminism. And the achievement of the right to vote. And so, good things and bad things come with that, right? I'm so grateful that I have the right to vote. And also, I think it was pretty silly that alcohol was outlawed for 30 years, right? So, I think we have to look at it we have to look at these things as historical trends, right? So, there's a particular challenge that we're facing right now, but in the global scheme of history, I don't think it's going to last, right? And so I think that the more that we kind of relieve some of our anxiety, like it's not like we stop fighting or like negotiating against that challenge, but it's like we just know that it's not going to be forever, and we can focus our efforts where it might be more impactful. As far as the future of Oregon wine specifically, I mean, barring somebody deciding, getting a crazy idea in their heads to ban alcohol again, I think the future of Oregon wine is incredibly bright. I mean, we have so much quality here. We have nothing to do but take market share from California and Washington. I think that the Oregon spirit of collaboration and partnership is just so strong. And I think that, we have so much room to grow in the markets and here at home. So I really love to see, things like the technical tastings and the rise of sparkling wine and, these things that are sort of industry-wide that are allowing us to be players on the national and international stage in more ways than one, right? OPC and IPNC and all of those sort of organizations that allow us to present our products against the international world of wine, I think can only play in our favor.
What about for you? What's coming up next for you? What's on the horizon that you're excited about?
So many things. I am really, so I've been in this role for about 9 months now as a marketing director, and I feel like I am just beginning to wrap my head around the scope of the role, especially here at a large company like Stoller Wine Group. And so for me, professionally, I think I'm really looking forward to just continuing to explore all of the possibilities with my team, with the tools that are available to us as marketers, with the opportunities that are coming online here at Stoller Wine Group. We're opening the Chehalem tasting room. There's so much potential that I feel like I could never get bored. It's like unlike that experience in production, which I hope all the winemakers who are watching this don't hate me for saying this, but unlike that experience where it felt like I was just kind of getting into a cycle, it was really repetitive. With this, it's like there's no repetition, right? And then all of the new digital tools and AI and all the creative tools that are available to us, like it's like you can never be an expert in some way. Like you can, but you're never going to fully master the craft. So I just love that. It's a little scary, it's a little daunting, but it's also so exciting. So personally, I find myself professionally, I find myself very motivated by that. So I look forward to coming as close as I can to mastering the craft, right? To always pursuing that elusive goal of perfection. And then, personally, I want to get outside more, right? Like we live in this beautiful state. There's so much to do. Summer is upon us. Last year I went on this dreamy backpacking trip up the, what is that? Eagle Creek Trail, the one that burned in 2017. Went up and did a really lovely backpacking trip up there and then came back down on the PCT, and we did that over Labor Day weekend, and I just had the most beautiful experience. So I love backpacking. I love being able to get out in the woods. I love camping, all of that. So, I want to do more of that and explore this beautiful state that I've been lucky enough to call my home.
All right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to cover today?
And I think we got it all.
Okay, got it all.
I don't think there was anything else I could have said.
Awesome. Well,
I told you at the beginning I was chatty.
The perfect person for an interview. We love it. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, taking the time to be part of our work here today on this beautiful Oregon summer day. Go ahead and let you off the hook.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.